The morning sun cast long shadows across the reservation as Maria Whitehorse walked slowly toward the community center. Her weathered hands gripped her walking stick, each step deliberate and measured. At 78 years old, she had seen many changes come to her Apache people, but nothing had prepared her for what was about to unfold on this particular Tuesday morning. Maria had been the keeper of stories for the Red Rock Apache Reservation for over 4 decades. Children would gather around her during the long winter evenings, listening with wide eyes as she shared the ancient tales passed down through generations. Her voice carried the wisdom of her ancestors, and her memory held the sacred traditions that kept their culture alive. The phone call had come at dawn. Sarah Running Bear, a young woman from the neighboring Sunset Mesa Reservation, had died unexpectedly in a car accident. The funeral was planned for Thursday at the Modern Funeral Home in Pine Valley, the small town that bordered both reservations. Maria had known Sarah since she was a little girl. Sarah's grandmother, Elena, had been Maria's closest friend until she passed away 5 years earlier. Maria remembered how Elena used to bring little Sarah to the story circles. The child would sit perfectly still, absorbing every word about Coyote's tricks and the wisdom of the eagle. When Sarah grew older, she would visit Maria during school breaks, asking questions about the old ways and learning the traditional songs. Though Sarah lived on a different reservation and belonged to a slightly different Apache band, the bonds of culture and friendship ran deep. As Maria prepared for the funeral, she carefully selected her best traditional dress. The black fabric was adorned with silver conchos that had belonged to her grandmother. She braided her long gray hair with strips of red cloth and placed her most precious turquoise necklace around her neck. These weren't just accessories. They were symbols of respect, worn to honor the deceased and show proper reverence for the sacred passage from life to death. The drive to Pine Valley took 40 minutes along winding desert roads. Maria's nephew Tommy had offered to drive her, understanding the importance of her presence at the funeral. As they approached the town, Maria noticed how different everything looked from the reservation. Modern buildings lined the main street, and the funeral home was a sleek, contemporary structure with large glass windows and manicured lawns. Tommy parked the truck and helped his aunt out. Maria straightened her dress and walked toward the entrance, her silver jewelry catching the afternoon light. Other Apache families were arriving, some from her own reservation and others from Sunset Mesa. She recognized many faces, people she had known for decades, united in their grief for young Sarah. But as Maria approached the front door, a man in a dark suit stepped forward. His name tag identified him as David Morrison, funeral director. His expression was polite but firm as he blocked her path. "Excuse me, ma'am," Morrison said, glancing nervously at Maria's traditional attire. "I'm afraid there's been some confusion. This is a private service for family only." Maria looked at him with surprise. "I am family," she replied quietly. "Not by blood, but by bonds that run deeper than blood. I have known Sarah since she was a small child." Morrison shook his head. "I'm sorry, but the arrangements specify immediate family members only. The family has requested a more contemporary service. They feel that traditional elements might be disruptive to the solemnity of the occasion." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. She had attended hundreds of funerals throughout her life, always welcome, always honored as an elder and keeper of traditions. Her presence was usually considered a blessing, a bridge between the living and the ancestors. "Who made this decision?" Maria asked, her voice steady despite her growing hurt. "Sarah's father, Robert Running Bear. He's trying to keep things simple, respectful. He doesn't want any cultural complications." Maria knew Robert Running Bear. He was a man who had distanced himself from traditional Apache ways, preferring to blend into the broader American culture. He worked as a manager at a telecommunications company in the city and rarely visited the reservation anymore. His daughter Sarah had been different. She had always shown interest in her heritage, often expressing frustration with her father's rejection of their ancestral ways. Standing there in the parking lot, Maria felt the weight of decades pressing down on her. She had lived through the boarding school era, when Apache children were forced to abandon their language and customs. She had survived the years when speaking Apache was forbidden, when traditional ceremonies were banned. She had watched as government policies tried to erase their identity, and she had fought to keep their culture alive through the darkest times. Now in 2023, she was being turned away from a funeral, not by the government or outside authorities, but by one of her own people. The irony was crushing. Tommy appeared at her side, having heard the exchange. His face was flushed with anger. "You can't be serious," he said to Morrison. "This woman is respected by every Apache on both reservations. She's a cultural treasure." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just following the family's wishes. I don't make these decisions." Maria placed a gentle hand on Tommy's arm. She had faced discrimination before, and she knew that anger would not serve them now. "It's all right," she said softly. "If Robert Running Bear does not want me here, then I will respect his wishes." As they walked back to the truck, Maria felt something breaking inside her chest. It wasn't just the rejection that hurt. It was what it represented. The loss of connection between the Apache people and their traditions was more devastating than any government policy had ever been. When Apache people themselves turned away from their elders and their customs, the culture faced its greatest threat. Tommy started the engine, but Maria asked him to wait a moment. Through the large windows of the funeral home, she could see people gathering inside. She spotted several Apache families she knew, people who would have welcomed her presence. They probably didn't even know she had been turned away. "What are you thinking, Aunt Maria?" Tommy asked gently. Maria was quiet for a long time, watching the mourners file into the building. Finally, she spoke. "I am thinking about Sarah and what she would have wanted. I am thinking about Elena, her grandmother, and the promise I made to always watch over their family. And I am thinking about what it means to honor our dead properly." As they drove away from the funeral home, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She would not simply accept this rejection. Sarah Running Bear deserved better than a sterile, disconnected farewell. The young woman who had loved Apache stories and traditions deserved to be honored in the way of their people. Maria began to plan something that would shake both reservations and teach everyone involved. A lesson about respect, tradition, and the true meaning of family. The news of Maria Whitehorse's rejection spread across both reservations like wildfire. By evening, her small house was filled with visitors, elders, middle-aged parents, and young people who had grown up listening to her stories. The living room buzzed with quiet conversations in both Apache and English, the air thick with indignation and disbelief. "This is wrong on so many levels," said Joseph Crowfeather, a respected elder from the Sunset Mesa Reservation. "Maria has been like a grandmother to children from both reservations for decades. She baptized my youngest granddaughter in the traditional way." Carmen Santos, a teacher at the reservation school, shook her head sadly. "Sarah used to talk about Maria all the time. She would quote her stories in my history class. That girl loved learning about our traditions." Tommy paced back and forth near the window, still angry about the afternoon's events. Robert Running Bear has forgotten where he comes from. His own daughter would be ashamed of what he did today. Maria sat quietly in her favorite chair, listening to the conversation swirling around her. Her weathered hands worked automatically, beating a small medallion while her mind processed what had happened. She had spent the drive home thinking not about her hurt feelings, but about Sarah and what the young woman would have wanted. "Tell us what you're thinking." "Grandmother," said Lucy Yazzie, a young woman in her 20s who worked as a social worker. Like many young Apache people, she called Maria grandmother out of respect, even though they weren't related by blood. Maria set down her beadwork and looked around the room at the concerned faces. "I am thinking about a story," she said quietly, and the room fell silent. When Maria began a story, everyone listened. "Many years ago, when I was about Lucy's age, there was a man on our reservation named Frank Goldtooth. Frank had spent years in the city, working in factories and trying to make a living in the white world. When he came back to the reservation, he was different. He wore only business suits, spoke only English to his children, and refused to participate in any traditional ceremonies. The room was completely quiet now, everyone understanding that Maria's stories always carried deeper meanings. Frank's mother was a medicine woman named Rose Goldtooth. When Rose became very ill and knew she was dying, she asked Frank to hold a traditional 4-day ceremony for her passing. She wanted to go to the spirit world properly with the songs and prayers of our people. Maria paused, her eyes distant with memory. Frank refused. He said those old ways were superstitious nonsense. He arranged for a modern funeral at the mission church with a preacher who barely knew his mother, and hymns sung in English. Rose passed away with tears in her eyes, knowing she would not have the proper send-off to help her spirit find its way home. Several people in the room shifted uncomfortably, understanding where the story was leading. But Rose had many friends and relatives who loved her. On the night of Frank's funeral, they gathered at the old ceremony grounds. They spent 4 days singing the death songs, telling stories about Rose, and conducting the proper rituals. They honored her memory the way she would have wanted, even though her own son had refused. Carmen leaned forward. What happened to Frank? Years later, Frank's own children began asking questions about their grandmother. They wanted to know the stories Rose would have told them, the traditions she would have taught them. Frank realized that by rejecting his mother's ways, he had stolen something precious from his own children. He came to me one day crying like a baby, asking if I could teach his kids what Rose would have taught them. The room was silent for several moments. Finally, Joseph spoke up. Are you saying we should hold our own ceremony for Sarah? Maria nodded slowly. Sarah Running Bear was raised by 2 worlds, but her heart belonged to the Apache way. Her grandmother Elena made me promise to watch over their family line. I cannot break that promise simply because Robert has forgotten who he is. But where would we hold it? Asked Lucy. And when? The old ceremony grounds at Sunset Mesa, Maria replied without hesitation. Tomorrow night, after Robert's funeral is over. We will give Sarah the proper farewell her spirit needs. Tommy stopped pacing and stared at his aunt. Maria, that could cause serious problems. Robert might try to stop us. He might even call the police. Maria's eyes flashed with a strength that reminded everyone why she had survived so much in her 78 years. Let him try. We will be on reservation land conducting a legal religious ceremony. Robert Running Bear may have forgotten his heritage, but he cannot erase it. Over the next hour, plans began to take shape. Word would be spread quietly through both reservations. People would bring traditional foods for the feast that honored the deceased. The drummers would bring their instruments, and the singers would prepare the death songs that helped guide spirits to the afterlife. Carmen offered to contact Sarah's college friends, many of whom were also Native American, and would understand the importance of the ceremony. Sarah talked about these traditions with her classmates. Some of them drove 5 hours to attend Robert's funeral today. They would want to be part of this too. Joseph volunteered to prepare the sacred fire and gather the traditional herbs needed for the ceremony. My grandson can help me collect the sage and cedar. The old spirits will know we are honoring them properly. As the evening wore on, more people arrived at Maria's house. The kitchen filled with women preparing food for the next day's ceremony. The men gathered outside, discussing logistics and making sure everything would be done correctly according to Apache tradition. Lucy pulled Maria aside during a quiet moment. Grandmother, aren't you worried about causing division between the reservations? Some people might think we're disrespecting Robert's wishes. Maria considered the question carefully. Child, sometimes doing what is right creates conflict with those who have lost their way. But if we always bow to those who have forgotten our traditions, then our traditions will die completely. Sarah's spirit deserves better than that. Late that night, after everyone had gone home, Maria sat alone in her kitchen drinking tea and thinking about Elena Running Bear. Sarah's grandmother had been one of the strongest Apache women Maria had ever known. Elena had raised Sarah during the summers, teaching her to speak Apache and sharing the old stories. She had died knowing that her granddaughter carried the traditions forward to a new generation. Maria could almost hear Elena's voice in the quiet house. You promised to watch over my family line, the voice seemed to say. My granddaughter needs the proper ceremony to find her way home. As Maria prepared for bed, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow would bring challenges and possibly conflict, but it would also bring justice for a young woman who had loved her Apache heritage enough to learn the old stories and songs. Outside her window, the desert night was filled with the sounds of coyotes calling to each other across the darkness. Maria smiled, remembering the stories she had told about Coyote, the trickster who often had to find creative ways to set things right when the world had gone wrong. Tomorrow, Maria Whitehorse would channel a little bit of Coyote's cunning to make sure Sarah Running Bear received the farewell she deserved. Thursday morning arrived gray and cloudy, with the smell of rain hanging heavy in the desert air. Maria woke before dawn as she had every day for the past 60 years, but today felt different. Today she would honor her promise to Elena Running Bear, no matter what obstacles stood in her way. As she dressed in her traditional ceremony clothes, Maria's phone began ringing. Word about the planned Apache ceremony had spread beyond the reservations, and reporters from the local newspaper wanted interviews. Maria let the calls go to voicemail. This wasn't about publicity or making political statements. This was about giving a young Apache woman the proper send-off her spirit needed. By mid-morning, Robert Running Bear's funeral service was underway at the Pine Valley Funeral Home. Maria could see the parking lot from Tommy's truck as they drove past on their way to gather supplies for the evening ceremony. The lot was full of cars, including several with license plates from Sarah's university town. "Look at all those people," Tommy observed. "Sarah touched a lot of lives." "Yes," Maria replied quietly, which makes it even sadder that her own father chose to exclude the people who helped shape who she became. They stopped at the trading post on the Sunset Mesa reservation to pick up sage, cedar, and other traditional ceremonial items. The store owner, an elderly Navajo man named Henry Begay, had heard about what happened at the funeral home. "That's wrong what they did to you." "Grandmother," Henry said as he carefully wrapped the sage bundles. "In the old days, elders were honored at every important ceremony. Now some of our own people treat us like relics." As Maria and Tommy continued their preparations, similar scenes were playing out across both reservations. Carmen Santos had taken a personal day from school to help coordinate food preparation with other women. Joseph Crowfeather and his sons were setting up the traditional fire pit at the old ceremony grounds, a sacred site that had been used for Apache rituals for generations. Lucy Yazzie was making phone calls to Sarah's college friends, explaining what would happen that evening. Many of them had never witnessed a traditional Apache funeral ceremony, but they understood its importance to Sarah's memory. "She talked about these ceremonies all the time," said Michael Lightfoot, one of Sarah's classmates from Arizona State University. She was writing her senior thesis on how traditional death rituals help Native communities maintain cultural identity. She would absolutely want this ceremony. By early afternoon, news of the planned ceremony had reached Robert Running Bear. He was still at the funeral home, greeting mourners and accepting condolences, when his brother David approached him with concern written across his face. "Robert, I just heard something troubling," David said, pulling his brother aside. "There's going to be some kind of Apache ceremony tonight at Sunset Mesa. People are saying it's for Sarah." Robert's face darkened. "What kind of ceremony?" "A traditional funeral ceremony. That old woman from Red Rock, Maria Whitehorse, is organizing it. Apparently she was upset about not being invited to today's service." Robert felt his anger rising. He had worked hard to distance himself and his family from what he saw as backward reservation traditions. He wanted Sarah remembered as a modern, educated young woman, not as some stereotypical Native American from the movies. "This is ridiculous," Robert muttered. Sarah barely knew those old ways. She was studying business, for crying out loud. She was going to work in the corporate world. David looked uncomfortable. "Well, actually, Robert, Sarah spent a lot of time learning traditional things from Elena before Mom died. And she visited Maria Whitehorse regularly when she was in college. Some people say she was really interested in Apache culture." This news hit Robert like a slap. He had always assumed his daughter shared his desire to assimilate into mainstream American society. The possibility that Sarah had been secretly embracing the very traditions he had rejected was deeply unsettling. "I have to stop this ceremony," Robert declared. "It's disrespectful to Sarah's memory and to our family's wishes." "How are you going to stop it?" David asked. "It's on reservation land and it's a religious ceremony. They have every right to hold it." Robert spent the rest of the afternoon making phone calls. He contacted the Sunset Mesa Tribal Council, demanding they prohibit the ceremony. He called the Bureau of Indian Affairs, claiming the ceremony was being held without proper permits. He even contacted the local sheriff's department, though they explained they had no jurisdiction over religious activities on reservation land. Every call ended in frustration. The ceremony was legal, it was on tribal land, and Maria Whitehorse had every right to conduct traditional Apache rituals. Meanwhile, at the old ceremony grounds, preparations continued throughout the day. Joseph Crowfeather had built a proper sacred fire, with wood arranged in the traditional pattern. Women from both reservations arrived with food for the feast that would follow the ceremony: fry bread, traditional stews, and other dishes that connected the mourners to their ancestral ways. The drummers began arriving in the late afternoon, carrying instruments that had been passed down through generations. These weren't tourist shop drums, but sacred instruments made by Apache hands and blessed in Apache ceremonies. The singers came too, elders who knew the death songs in the original Apache language. As the sun began to set, cars started filling the dirt parking area near the ceremony grounds. License plates showed people had come from across Arizona and New Mexico. Several vehicles had university parking stickers indicating that Sarah's college friends had made the long drive to honor her memory properly. Maria arrived an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. She wore her finest traditional dress, the one reserved for the most important occasions. Her silver and turquoise jewelry caught the firelight as she walked slowly toward the sacred fire, her walking stick marking each deliberate step. The sight of her silenced the gathered crowd. Here was a woman who had lived through 8 decades of change, who had watched her people struggle to maintain their identity in a rapidly changing world. Her presence alone validated the importance of what they were about to do. Friends, relatives, all who loved Sarah Running Bear, Maria said, her voice carrying clearly in the desert evening air. We gather tonight not in anger or defiance, but in love and respect. We gather to give this young woman the farewell her spirit needs to find its way home to the ancestors. As she spoke, headlights appeared on the access road leading to the ceremony grounds. A line of vehicles was approaching, and Maria could see that the lead car was Robert Running Bear's expensive SUV. Tommy moved closer to his aunt, ready to protect her if necessary. It looks like Robert decided to try to stop us after all. Maria remained calm, her hand steady on her walking stick. Let him come, she said quietly. Perhaps it is time for Robert Running Bear to remember who he really is. The vehicle stopped at the edge of the ceremony area, and Robert got out, followed by several family members and friends from the morning's funeral service. His face was set in hard lines as he strode toward Maria and the gathered mourners. The two groups faced each other across the sacred fire. On one side, the Apache people dressed in traditional clothes and ready to conduct an ancient ceremony. On the other side, Robert and his supporters in modern funeral attire, representing a different vision of how Sarah should be remembered. The confrontation that was about to unfold would force everyone present to examine what it truly meant to honor the dead and respect the living. The desert evening grew quiet as Robert Running Bear approached the sacred fire, his dress shoes crunching on the rocky ground. Behind him walked a small group of supporters from the morning's funeral, relatives who had embraced assimilation and friends from his corporate world who looked uncomfortable in the traditional ceremony setting. Maria Whitehorse stood perfectly still beside the fire, her silver jewelry reflecting the dancing flames. Around her, nearly 200 Apache people had gathered from both reservations, along with Sarah's college friends who had driven hours to attend. The silence stretched taut as father and elder faced each other across decades of cultural divide. This needs to stop right now, Robert declared, his voice carrying the authority he used in business meetings. You people have no right to hijack my daughter's memory for your own purposes. Sarah was a modern woman who chose to live in the real world, not cling to outdated traditions. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the gathered mourners, but Maria raised her hand for silence. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. Robert Running Bear, I understand your pain. Losing a child is the greatest sorrow a parent can face. But Sarah was not only your daughter. She was Elena's granddaughter, and Elena was my closest friend. I promised to watch over your family line, and I cannot break that promise. My mother is dead, Robert shot back, and her backward ideas died with her. Sarah was studying business administration. She was going to work for a Fortune 500 company. She didn't need your primitive rituals. The words hit the crowd like physical blows. Several younger Apache men stepped forward angrily, but Maria's walking stick tapped sharply against a stone, calling for calm. Tell me. Robert, Maria said, her voice still steady. When did you last speak to your daughter about her studies? When did you last ask her what she was learning in school? The question seemed to catch Robert off guard. We talked all the time. She called me every week. And did she tell you about her senior thesis? Maria continued. Did she mention that she was writing about traditional Apache death ceremonies and their importance to cultural survival? A ripple of surprise went through Robert's group. One of Sarah's college friends, a young Navajo woman named Jessica Yazzie, stepped forward from the crowd. Mr. Running Bear, I was Sarah's study partner, Jessica said respectfully. She spent months researching traditional Apache funeral practices. She interviewed dozens of elders from different reservations. She said she wanted to understand what her grandmother Elena had tried to teach her. Robert stared at the young woman, confusion replacing anger on his face. That can't be right. Sarah was focused on her business degree. She was double majoring, added Michael Lightfoot, another of Sarah's classmates. Business and Native American Studies. She was planning to work for tribal economic development programs after graduation. She wanted to help reservations build sustainable businesses while maintaining cultural traditions. The words seemed to knock the wind out of Robert. He looked around at the faces surrounding him. Apache people who had known his daughter, college friends who had shared her dreams, elders who had watched her grow up summers with Elena. She never told me any of this, Robert whispered. Carmen Santos stepped forward from the crowd. Robert, Sarah came to my classroom every summer to help teach Apache language to the younger children. She was fluent in our traditional tongue, something she learned from your mother. She used to say she wanted to be a bridge between the old ways and the new world. Dr. Patricia Longhorn, one of Sarah's professors who had made the drive from the university, approached Robert with a manila folder in her hands. Mr. Running Bear, I brought Sarah's thesis draft. She asked me to give it to her family if anything ever happened to her. Perhaps you should read it. Robert took the folder with trembling hands. The cover page read, Sacred Passages, How Traditional Apache Death Ceremonies Preserve Cultural Identity in the Modern World, by Sarah Elena Running Bear. He opened to a random page and began reading aloud, his voice breaking. My grandmother Elena taught me that death is not an ending but a transition. The Apache ceremonies guide the spirit of the deceased to the ancestors while helping the living maintain their connection to tribal identity. When we abandon these traditions, we lose more than rituals. We lose the threads that weave us together as a people. Tears began flowing down Robert's cheeks as he continued reading. My father believes that success means leaving the reservation behind and joining mainstream American society. I respect his choice, but I believe true success means finding ways to honor our heritage while building new opportunities for future generations. The desert evening had grown completely quiet except for the crackling of the sacred fire and Robert's voice reading his daughter's words. With each sentence, it became clearer that Sarah Running Bear had been on a journey to reclaim the Apache identity her father had abandoned. She writes about you, Maria, Robert said, his voice barely audible. She calls you the keeper of our stories and says you taught her that culture isn't a museum piece to be preserved, but a living river that must keep flowing to stay pure. Maria nodded slowly. Sarah understood something that took me many years to learn. We don't have to choose between honoring our ancestors and building our futures. The strongest trees are those with the deepest roots. Robert closed the thesis folder and looked around at the assembled crowd with new eyes. These weren't backward people clinging to the past. They were teachers, social workers, college students, business owners, and community leaders who had found ways to maintain their cultural identity while succeeding in the modern world. I've made a terrible mistake, Robert said, his voice heavy with regret. I thought I was protecting Sarah from a world that would hold her back. Instead, I kept her from sharing the most important part of herself with me. Joseph Crow Feather approached Robert with gentle dignity. Son, grief makes us all do things we regret later. But it's not too late to honor your daughter the way she would have wanted. Robert looked at Maria, seeing her for the first time not as a relic from a discredited past, but as the wise elder his own daughter had respected and learned from. What do I need to do? Just listen, Maria replied simply. Let us sing Sarah's spirit home. Let us tell the stories that will keep her memory alive in the proper way. Let us show her that her people remember who she was and what she dreamed of becoming. Slowly, Robert nodded. His supporters from the corporate world looked uncomfortable and began drifting back toward their cars, but several of his Apache relatives stayed, removing their ties and jackets as they prepared to participate in the traditional ceremony. As the drummers began the first death song, Robert Running Bear took a place in the circle beside Maria Whitehorse. For the first time in decades, he was ready to remember what it meant to be Apache. The ceremony that followed would not only honor Sarah's memory, but begin healing a wound that had divided father from daughter, tradition from progress, and Apache from Apache. Sometimes it takes a death to remind the living what truly matters. The drums began with a slow, steady heartbeat that seemed to echo the pulse of the earth itself. Maria Whitehorse moved to the east side of the sacred fire, her voice rising in the ancient Apache death song that had guided spirits home for countless generations. The melody was haunting and beautiful, carrying words in the old language that spoke of journeys and homecomings, of love that transcends the boundary between life and death. Robert Running Bear stood transfixed as the ceremony unfolded around him. He had heard these songs as a child before he decided they belonged to a world he wanted to leave behind. Now, listening to them sung for his daughter, he felt something awakening in his chest, a recognition, a remembering, a grief deeper than anything he had experienced at the morning's sterile funeral service. Other voices joined Maria's, creating harmonies that seemed to lift Sarah's spirit on invisible wings. Joseph Crowfeather added his deep bass to the chorus, while Carmen Santos and Lucy Yazzie wove their voices through the melody like silver threads through dark cloth. Even Sarah's college friends, who didn't know the Apache words, hummed along, their hearts understanding what their minds couldn't translate. As the first song ended, Maria spoke to the assembled crowd in both Apache and English, sharing memories of Sarah that painted a picture of a young woman caught between two worlds but determined to build bridges between them. Sarah, Elena Running Bear, was born on a winter morning when the snow covered the desert like a blessing, Maria began, her voice carrying the cadence of ancient storytelling. Her grandmother Elena brought her to me when she was only 3 days old, asking me to whisper a prayer in her ear, a prayer that she would grow strong in both worlds, that she would remember her people while reaching for the stars. Robert listened, amazed to learn details about his daughter's early life that he had never heard. In his pursuit of assimilation, he had missed so much of what made Sarah who she truly was. Maria continued. When Sarah was 7, she came to stay with Elena for the summer. She was shy and spoke only English, but by the end of those 3 months she was chattering away in Apache and helping her grandmother prepare traditional medicines. Elena would tell me, "This child has the spirit of a bridge builder. She will help our people find new paths while keeping the old wisdom alive." As Maria spoke, others began sharing their own memories. Carmen told about Sarah volunteering to teach Apache language classes during her college breaks. Michael Lightfoot shared how Sarah had organized a campus group to preserve Native American oral histories. Jessica Yazzie described how Sarah had insisted on conducting parts of her business presentations in Apache, explaining to confused professors that true leadership meant being proud of where you came from. With each story, Robert's understanding of his daughter deepened and his regret grew heavier. He had been so focused on helping Sarah succeed in the white world that he had failed to see how she was creating her own unique path, one that honored both her Apache heritage and her modern education. The ceremony continued with the ritual feeding of the fire. Each person approached the flames and offered something meaningful: tobacco, sage, cedar, or small personal items that had connected them to Sarah. When Robert's turn came, he hesitated, realizing he had nothing appropriate to offer. Tommy Whitehorse, Maria's nephew, quietly handed Robert a small bundle of sage. "She would want you to participate," Tommy whispered. As Robert approached the fire, memories flooded back. Summers at Elena's house when Sarah was small, watching his mother teach his daughter to weave baskets and identify medicinal plants. He had dismissed these activities as old-fashioned time-wasting, but now he understood they were lessons in identity, belonging, and cultural survival. He placed the sage in the flames and whispered, "Sarah, forgive me for not seeing who you really were. Forgive me for not understanding what you were trying to tell me." The sage flared bright, sending sweet smoke spiraling into the star-filled sky. Around the fire, the Apache mourners began the storytelling portion of the ceremony, sharing tales that would keep Sarah's memory alive in the traditional way. These weren't just reminiscences. They were the oral history that would ensure future generations knew about the young woman who had tried to bridge two worlds. Dr. Patricia Longhorn approached Robert during a quiet moment between stories. "Your daughter was remarkable," she said gently. She had job offers from 3 major corporations, but she was planning to turn them all down. She wanted to work for the Apache Economic Development Council, helping tribes start businesses that could compete in the global market while maintaining cultural values. Robert shook his head in wonder. "I pushed her so hard to succeed in the corporate world. I thought that was the only way she could have a good life." "She was going to succeed," Dr. Longhorn replied, "but on her own terms, in her own way. She understood something that many people struggle with. You don't have to abandon your culture to achieve great things. Sometimes your culture is exactly what gives you the strength to achieve great things." As the night wore on, The ceremony evolved into something more than just a funeral ritual. It became a teaching moment, a healing circle, a bridge between generations and worldviews. Young Apache people who had been struggling with their own cultural identity found inspiration in Sarah's story. Elders who had worried about the future of their traditions saw hope in the college students who had driven hours to honor their friends' Apache heritage. Most importantly, Robert Running Bear began to understand the profound loss he had inflicted not just on himself, but on his daughter. By rejecting his Apache identity, he had forced Sarah to seek her cultural education elsewhere, creating a painful distance between them that neither had known how to bridge. Around midnight, as the ceremony began to wind down, something unexpected happened. A convoy of cars appeared on the horizon, headlights cutting through the desert darkness. As the vehicles drew closer, Robert could see they were filled with people from the morning's funeral, Apache relatives who had attended his modern service but had heard about the traditional ceremony and driven out to participate. His cousin Margaret Running Bear was the first to approach the fire. "Robert, I'm sorry we didn't come sooner," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We were confused about what to do. We wanted to respect your wishes, but we also knew Sarah would have wanted this ceremony." Behind Margaret came a dozen other relatives, some still wearing their funeral clothes from the morning service. They had spent hours debating whether to come, torn between respecting Robert's authority as Sarah's father and honoring what they knew Sarah herself would have wanted. "We couldn't stay away," explained Robert's uncle, David Crow Dog, an old man who had rarely spoken to Robert since he left the reservation. "That girl used to visit me every summer, asking me to teach her the old stories. She had more Apache spirit in her little finger than some people have in their whole bodies." As these latecomers joined the circle, the ceremony took on new energy. The drummers, who had been preparing to end their performance, struck up another song. Maria, despite her 78 years, seemed to gain strength from the growing crowd, her voice rising clear and strong in the night air. Robert found himself standing between two worlds. His corporate associates had long since departed, uncomfortable with the unfamiliar ritual, while his Apache relatives welcomed him back into a circle he had voluntarily left decades earlier. The choice of which world to embrace was no longer theoretical. It required action, commitment, a willingness to be vulnerable. As dawn approached, the ceremony entered its final phase. The sacred fire had burned low, its flames dancing hypnotically in the pre-dawn darkness. Maria called for the concluding song, a melody that celebrated the completed journey of Sarah's spirit to the ancestor world, while blessing those left behind to continue their earthly work. But before the final song could begin, Robert stepped forward into the circle. His voice, unused to public speaking outside corporate boardrooms, cracked with emotion as he addressed the gathered mourners. "I need to say something before we finish," he began, looking directly at Maria. "25 years ago, I made a decision that I believed would give my family a better life. I turned my back on everything my mother tried to teach me. I spoke only English in my house. I refused to participate in tribal ceremonies. I thought I was protecting my daughter from a world that would limit her opportunities." The crowd listened in respectful silence as Robert continued. "Tonight I learned that my daughter was not the person I thought she was. She was better, braver, and wiser than I ever imagined. While I was running away from our Apache identity, she was running toward it, trying to build bridges I had burned." Tears flowed freely down Robert's face as he pulled out Sarah's thesis and held it up to the firelight. Sarah wrote that culture isn't something to be preserved like a museum piece, but something to be lived and grown and shared. She understood what I forgot, that our traditions don't hold us back, they give us the strength to move forward. He looked around the circle at faces illuminated by firelight, elders who carried ancient wisdom, young people who were finding ways to honor that wisdom while building modern lives, college students who saw no contradiction between Apache identity and academic achievement. "Maria Whitehorse," Robert said, his voice hoarse 6 months after Sarah's ceremony. The Red Rock Apache Reservation looked different to Robert Running Bear as he drove his truck along the familiar dirt roads. The expensive SUV he had owned for years sat unused in his garage, replaced by a practical pickup that could handle the rough terrain between his new apartment in town and the reservation where he now spent most of his time. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, Robert sat in Maria Whitehorse's living room with a small group of adults, learning to speak the Apache language his mother had tried to teach him 40 years earlier. His pronunciation was terrible, his grammar worse, but Maria patiently corrected him with the same gentle persistence she had shown to countless children over the decades. "Repeat after me," Maria would say in Apache, then switch to English. "The eagle soars above the sacred mountain." Robert would stumble through the Apache words, his business-trained tongue struggling with sounds that should have been as natural as breathing. But each lesson brought small victories, moments when a phrase would click into place and he would hear an echo of his mother's voice in his own words. The language lessons were just the beginning of Robert's cultural education. Joseph Crowfeather had taken him under his wing, teaching him the proper way to participate in ceremonies, the meaning behind different rituals, and the responsibilities that came with being an Apache man. It was like learning to walk again, rediscovering muscles and movements he had deliberately forgotten. Culture isn't something you put on like clothes for special occasions, Joseph explained one afternoon as they prepared sage bundles for an upcoming ceremony. It's supposed to be part of how you breathe, how you think, how you treat other people. Your daughter understood that. Now you need to understand it too. Robert had also begun working with Dr. Patricia Longhorn and Sarah's former classmates to establish the Sarah Elena Running Bear Foundation. Using a significant portion of his corporate savings, Robert created a scholarship program for Apache students pursuing degrees that would help their communities. Business, education, social work, law, and medicine. But unlike traditional scholarships that focus solely on academic achievement, the Sarah Elena Running Bear scholarships required recipients to demonstrate knowledge of Apache culture and commit to spending time working on reservation development projects. The first scholarship recipients were announced at a ceremony held at the old grounds where Sarah's traditional funeral had taken place. 25 young Apache people received funding to continue their education, each one committed to following Sarah's model of bridging traditional culture with modern opportunities. During the scholarship ceremony, Robert stood before the gathered crowd and spoke in halting but determined Apache, announcing each recipient's name and their area of study. His pronunciation was still imperfect, but the effort brought tears to many eyes, especially Maria's. After the formal presentations ended, Robert found himself surrounded by young Apache people, eager to talk about their dreams and plans. These weren't the aimless, culturally disconnected youth he had expected to find on the reservation. They were ambitious, articulate, and proudly Apache, seeing no contradiction between honoring their heritage and pursuing professional success. "Mr. Running Bear," said Amanda Crow Dog, a business major at Northern Arizona University, "I wanted to thank you for understanding what Sarah was trying to do. My grandfather says you found your way home." The words hit Robert with unexpected force. Home. For decades, he had thought home was his corporate office, his suburban house, his position in the non-native business community. But sitting here surrounded by Apache young people planning to change the world while staying true to their roots, he realized home had been waiting for him all along. One of the most profound changes in Robert's life was his relationship with Maria Whitehorse. The woman he had once dismissed as a relic from the past had become his most important teacher, and surprisingly, one of his closest friends. Their conversations ranged from Apache history and traditions to modern economic development strategies for reservations. "You know," Maria said one evening as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the desert in brilliant oranges and purples, "Sarah would be proud of what you're doing. But she would also tell you that this is just the beginning." Robert nodded, understanding what Maria meant. Learning to be Apache again wasn't a destination but a journey, one that would continue for the rest of his life. Every ceremony, every language lesson, every conversation with elders revealed new layers of identity he had spent decades burying. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Several of Robert's former corporate colleagues couldn't understand his sudden interest in Indian stuff, as one insensitively put it. He had lost some business relationships and social connections, but he had gained something infinitely more valuable, a sense of belonging, purpose, and connection to something larger than himself. Robert's brother David had been initially skeptical of his dramatic lifestyle change, suspecting it might be a temporary grief reaction that would fade with time. But as months passed and Robert's commitment to Apache culture deepened, David began asking questions of his own. Soon, two brothers who had barely spoken Apache in 40 years were practicing conversation together, laughing at their mistakes and encouraging each other's progress. The ripple effects of Sarah's ceremony continued to spread beyond Robert's personal transformation. The story of Maria being barred from the funeral, only to organize a traditional ceremony that brought healing to a divided family, had been covered by regional newspapers and even a national magazine article about cultural preservation. The coverage brought attention to the challenges faced by Native American communities, trying to maintain traditions while adapting to modern realities. More importantly, the story inspired other Apache families dealing with similar cultural disconnections. Carmen Santos reported that enrollment in Apache language classes at the reservation school had doubled. Young parents who had been ambivalent about teaching their children traditional ways were now bringing them to Maria's storytelling circles. On the first anniversary of Sarah's death, Robert organized a memorial ceremony that honored both his daughter's memory and the journey her death had inspired. The ceremony was held at the university where Sarah had studied, bringing together Apache elders, college students, professors, and community leaders in a unique celebration of cultural bridge building. Dr. Longhorn spoke about Sarah's academic achievements and her vision for tribal economic development. Maria told traditional stories that illustrated the same principles Sarah had written about in her thesis. Young Apache professionals shared how Sarah's example had influenced their own career choices, but the most powerful moment came when Robert stood before the assembled crowd and read from his daughter's thesis, his Apache pronunciation much improved after months of study. The future of Apache people lies not in choosing between tradition and progress, but in understanding that our traditions are what make our progress meaningful. We honor our ancestors not by living exactly as they lived, but by carrying their wisdom into new challenges and opportunities. As Robert read his daughter's words, he realized she had been trying to teach him the same lesson Maria Whitehorse had spent 78 years sharing with their community. Culture wasn't a burden to be shed or a museum piece to be preserved unchanged. It was a living river that needed to keep flowing to stay pure, adapting to new landscapes while maintaining its essential character. The ceremony ended with the same death song that had been sung at Sarah's traditional funeral, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just a farewell to the deceased, but a celebration of the ongoing life her death had inspired. Sarah Elena Running Bear had succeeded in building the bridge she had dreamed of, a connection between worlds that honored the past while embracing the future. As people began to leave the university ceremony, Maria Whitehorse approached Robert with a small wrapped bundle. Inside was a traditional Apache prayer pipe, carved from red stone and decorated with symbols representing the 4 directions. "This belonged to your mother," Maria explained. "Elena gave it to me before she died, asking me to give it to someone who would use it properly." "I think Sarah would want you to have it now." Robert held the pipe with trembling hands, feeling the smooth stone that had been touched by his mother's fingers, blessed by her prayers connected to generations of Apache spiritual practice. It was more than an artifact, it was a responsibility, a calling, a bridge between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. That evening, as the desert sky filled with stars, Robert Running Bear knelt beside the sacred fire at the old ceremony grounds and offered his first prayer in the Apache language. The words came slowly, imperfectly, but with deep sincerity as he thanked his daughter for leading him home and promised to spend the rest of his life honoring the traditions she had died loving. In the flickering firelight, surrounded by the vast silence,